Hi, welcome to SAP UI5 tutorial. So in this tutorial we are going to learn how to perform CRUD operations with model. Okay, so to do this let me show you the output first and then let's go back to implementation. Okay, so in case if you implement that same, so let's see, so this is the URL I have. Okay, so in this, so there is a button called add button and then there is a table over here. So as of now, if you can see here, so this is an empty table. If I click on add button, I'm just displaying one dialog box. So I'm just entering some names and then entering some data over here, and then whenever I click on save button, so I'm inserting one record into the table, right? In the same way, in case if you start, you can keep inserting data into the table. Okay, let me create the mail and then we save it. So you can see here, and then in case if you want to edit this record, so I have two buttons provided over here. So one is edit and one is delete button. Okay, so let me edit this one. Instead of a, I want to create a updated. Okay, so let's save this one. You can see here a updated, and in case if let's go here, in case if you want to edit this one also, let me click on this edit button and you can see all the data, and then you can edit this one. Let's say be updated, or contact number is 2345678. Okay, save it and then you can see here. Okay, so in case if you want to delete this, so obviously delete functionality. So we are going to implement this particular this particular thing in this particular tutorial. Okay, so let's go to the Eclipse and start creating the project, right? So let's create a project called SAP UI5 project. Okay, so click on next and give a name called CRUD OPER. Okay, CRUD operations, right? So click on next and then give the name of the controller or the view is test, and which is of type XML. Click on finish. Okay, so it's gonna create a project. Yes, the project got created. So now we are going to implement this particular requirement. So if you would have remembered this screen, okay, let's go back to the screen. Okay, so we should have a add button and then one table, right? So we need to create these two things first, right? So let's go back to the Eclipse. Okay, in case if you want to uh, uh, you know in case if you want to render a button, so then obviously, so we have to use a button. So before that, so let's create the table first. Okay, so what I will do is I'll simply change the title to CRUD operations. Okay, save this, and then what I can do is, so we are going to create a table. So as we discussed in the last tutorial, in case if you want to create a table in SAP UI5, there is something called as table, right? So create the table object. Okay, create the table object like this, sorry, table like this, and then so items is an aggregation, so let's keep an items. Okay, items by items, and then so in the table should have the columns. Again, a columns is an aggregation. Okay, so inside these columns we are going to render all the columns, right? So what I will do is I'll just create few columns over here. Okay, so let me select all, control I, so it will arrange properly, it will beautify the file. Okay, so here I have created few columns like name, gender, and date of birth, center. I mean, sorry, this is a father's name, contact number, and the action. Okay, so this action is to edit or delete, right? So once we created a column, so as we discussed in the previous tutorial, the table expects a template, right? So to create the template, we have something called as column list item by column list item. Okay, so in this cell, so this is the one which is belongs to this particular column, this is the one which is belongs to this column, and like this. So all this belongs to corresponding columns. If you can see here, this H box belongs to this column. Okay, so that means 1 2 3 4 5, again this is 6. In the same way, 1 2 3 4 5 and 6 columns, right? So now save this and just run this project. So if you want to run this, give a right click and then select this run as and web app preview. Okay, so let it run. So it will take a few minutes because the system is slow. You can see the busy indicator. Yes, now the project is up and running. So let's copy this URL. Okay, go back to the browser and then so open one more tab. So let's make it as a first one, and this is the second one. Okay, so let's paste it here and then refresh this. You can see one table. So now we are going to display the button on top of this particular table. So each and every table will be having a header in it. So just create a header of this particular toolbar. So just to create the create the header of the table. Okay, so to create the header of the table, so there is something called as header toolbar aggregation inside a table, and use that header toolbar, and the header toolbar expects a toolbar, and the toolbar you create a button. Okay, so let's do that now. Okay, let's go back to the view, and in here the way how this columns aggregation, in the same way there is an aggregation called header toolbar, and then let's do this. Okay, so header toolbar by header toolbar, and this expects a toolbar control. In the toolbar control, so you can provide a button. Okay, this is a add button, so I'm giving a space in the left side so that it will render in the right side, and then the button text is add student, and then when the user clicks on that particular add students button, so I'm gonna execute this method. Okay, when the user press that button, so this is the method which will get execute. Okay, so far I didn't implement this method, so we're gonna implement this one later. So let's execute this. Let's open the browser and then see the output. Okay, yes, so if you can see here there is an add button, right? So if you click on this, so we're going to execute one method. So we didn't implement that one so far, so that's the reason there is no output. So whenever the user clicks on this, so we are going to show one dialog box wherein the user can input the data, right? So like, let me open this one. If the user clicks on this, see here, so like this we are going to display one dialog box, right? For that we need to design this dialog box. So again, as we discussed in the previous tutorial, this is a fragment, right? We need to implement a fragment. Okay, so now what I can do is, so this is our current application, and go back to the Eclipse and create this particular method. Okay, so create this method and go back to the controller. Let's uncomment all let's uncomment these two methods. Okay, so now what I will do is I will create a method, I mean to say the function or method. Okay, so function, and inside this function let's create O event. Okay, yes, we have created a function, and then we need to implement a fragment, right? So in case if you want to implement a fragment, so let me create a fragment first. In case if you want to create a fragment, then obviously we need to create a new file. So the name of the file is register dot, okay, fragment dot xml. This is how we are going to create a fragment. So the fragment name must be end with dot fragment dot xml. So before that, this is the name of the fragment. Okay, so let's click on finish, and then let's try to implement this fragment, right? So the fragments, the way we are going to create this view, we are going to create the fragment. So if in case if you want to create a fragment, there is something called as core colon fragment definition. Okay, so create a fragment and then try to implement this fragment. So since it is a dialog box, right? Okay, so create a dialog box in here. Okay, and close the dialog box. Inside this dialog box, let's create a form. Okay, so we're going to create a form, and then form content by form content, and then let's create form by form. Okay, so yes, so let's create a form and create the content of the form. So for that, what I will do is I'll simply create one, uh, let's say this basic information title. Okay, so what I will do now is, so I don't want to implement this one, so let's read this fragment and then try to whenever the user clicks on that button, try to show this particular fragment. So for that, so we have some callback handler. So this is the callback handler we have. So let's go to this callback handler and try to implement this particular callback handler. So for the first time, in case if you want to read the XML file, then obviously we need to use something called as sap.ui.xml fragment. Okay, so save this, and then so here this particular fragment is under this folder. Okay, so let's give copy the name of the folder and paste it here. Okay, save this. Okay, once you read this fragment, so we are going to, so since this fragment contains a dialog box, we are going to open this particular dialog box. How can we open the dialog box? Obviously we have to use something called as new fragment dot open dot, sorry, new fragment dialog box dot open. Okay, so now save this and then go back to the browser. Okay, so go back to the browser and refresh the browser, and now click on this. So now you can see, so we are able to open the fragment. So now let's try to implement this fragment. Okay, so let's put, press escape so that it will get closed. So now go back to the fragment again. Yeah, go back to the fragment, and in here try to implement this fragment. Okay, so first I need to have the name. Okay, and then last name, of course first name, last name, and then gender, right? So implement these three. So let me come here. Okay, so I have this. So first I have a name, so which I'm gonna render, which I'm gonna ask the user to enter first name and then middle name and then last name. So after this, so I'm gonna uh, create one icon, right? So then, so the next field is gender. So in the gender is either male or female. So that is the reason we are taking radio button, radio group by radio group, and sorry, radio button group. Okay, so inside this, so we are going to provide the two buttons. Okay, save this. Okay, let's go back to the browser and then refresh the browser and then try to click on this button again. So now you can see these two fields which we implemented, we are able to see over here in this particular dialog box. Okay, so now let's go ahead with the implementation and go to the Eclipse again and try to implement the rest. So what is that? So the date of birth and then father's name and then contact number. Okay, so let's implement these three. Okay, so okay, come here. Okay, just if you can see here, label, date of birth, again it is date picker, and then father's name, it is an input field, and then contact number, again it is an input field. Okay, so let's save this particular fragment and go back to the browser and then try to refresh the browser and then click on add button. So you can see all these output. So all these three elements got rendered on top of this dialog box, right? So let's go ahead with the implementation again. So go to the Eclipse. Okay, so and then what we need is, we need to implement something called as alternative number. Okay, and then we should have two buttons, right? So let's try to implement that. Okay, come here, and then so alternative number, again this is an input field, and then this is a label. I'm just providing empty label just to make sure that these two buttons will render in the next line. Okay, save this and go back to the browser. Okay, go back to the browser and then refresh this. Okay, so click on this one. So now you can see I have rendered these two buttons and then alternative number. So if you can see here, this is green and red. So green is the button is of type uh, the button is of type accept, yes, and the button, if the type of the button is reject, then obviously it will render red in color. Yeah, okay, so whenever you click on the save and button, so we need to implement this particular dialog functionality. To implement this, so let me go back to this. Whenever you click on this, cancel, we need to close the dialog box. So let's implement that first. So go back to the Eclipse. Okay, what is this function? So that function is handle cancel button press. So let's go back to the controller and come here and separate, put a separator and then implement this method function, and then yes, save this. So whenever the user clicks on this, we need to close the dialog box. The dialog box is there inside this particular object. So this dot, this this is a variable, so that means this is a global variable. This variable can be accessed anywhere in this particular controller. So that means you can access from here also, right? So we are getting this particular dialog box and then we are closing the dialog box. Okay, save this and go back to the browser and then refresh the browser. You can see yes, click on this and click on cancel. See, you are able to cancel that, but you are not able to open this dialog box for the second time. Okay, so what is the issue here? So let's go back to the Eclipse again. So here you are again trying to read this particular object, so this is not correct. So what you need to do is, first you need to check if, okay, if the dialog box instance does not exist, that means if this dot dialog box new student dialog box does not exist, if it is not there, then read this, otherwise don't read this. Okay, so Control X, and then once you read this, then open this. Okay, let's go back to the browser and then refresh this. Okay, so then click on this. So yes, we are able to open for the first time, and then click on cancel and try to open it again. So now you can see, so we are opening multiple times and then we are closing the box multiple times, right? So now what we need to do is, so whenever the user clicks on this, we need to uh, bind some data, some object to this entire dialog box, so that when the user clicks on save, we can get the total object back, okay, instead of getting each and every field. So that means we need to create a model, and then we need to create a data for that, and then we need to bind this particular model to that particular dialog box. Okay, so let's go back to the Eclipse and try to do that one. Okay, so in case if you want to create the JSON model, then obviously, so there is something called as SAP JSON model. Create the object of that, and then just set the model to that. Okay, so just go here and then set the model, and we set the model. Okay, fine. So now what we need to do is, yes, so we set a model, and then we need to set the data to that, right? So to create the data, then how many values are there? So we have so many input fields rendered over there. So for each and every input field, there should be one value to that, there should be one value to bind, right? So for that, so there is something, let's create one variable. So the name of the variable is student. Okay, so let's, okay, go to the init method. So what I will do is, I will simply create one student like this. Okay, so once you create the student object, so what we can do is, so we can set this particular data to the model which we already set to this particular dialog box. To do that, so we need to get the model first, and then we need to set the data, right? So let's set the data now. Okay, so come to this line. Okay, so just make it end and set the data. So the data must be this dot what is that, student. Okay, so now we set a data to that, right? And then try to open this particular okay, let's set the data in the next line. Okay, yes, we had set the data. Okay, save this, and then go back to your browser, and let's try to refresh this particular application. So I refreshed it, and I'm opening this, and I'm clicking on save. So since we didn't implement the save button, okay, let's try to implement the save button now. Okay, you can enter the data. So whichever the data you enter in here, okay, so it will be saved into the model, right? So let's, to do that, so let's see, now we have entered the data, and then in case if you want to get the data, so which is entered by the user, then obviously we need to implement the save button, right? So let's go ahead and try to implement the save button. Okay, let's go back to this Eclipse here, and in here, what is this save button? Okay, this is the save. Whenever the user presses this save button, so this is the method which will get executed. So let's implement this method. Okay, so comma, so this create a method first, function, and then try to implement this particular method. So here, so we need to get the model of this particular dialog box. So o event is a default parameter. So o event dot get source, so this will give you the dialog box, and from there we are getting the model. Okay, so then once we get the model, we need to get the data from this particular model, right? So get the model, yes, we got the data, and then what we need to do is uh, we need to set this model to the table, right? In case if you want to set the model to the table, so the table should have a model which is already set to the table. right? So for that, so we didn't set the model to the table. So for that, what we need to do is, so we have to set a model to the table first. Okay, so what I will do is, I'll simply create a model in on after rendering method. What I will do is, I will create a model. So in case if you want to create a model, there should be a data for that, right? So let's create the data first. Okay, so what I will do is this dot data. So you can create the variable wherever you want. Okay, but I'm just trying to create the global variables so that I can use wherever I want. Okay, so I have a data, and then I need to create what is that, a model, right? So let's go here and then create the JSON model with particular data. Okay, so now let's set this particular model to the view. Okay, so we set a model. So now what we did was we created a model and we set a model to the view. So that means now we have two models. That means we have one view and one dialog, right? So for this view we have one model, for this dialog one model, right? So now when the user clicks on a button inside the view, so we are opening this particular dialog box. Okay, we are opening the dialog box which is having this model. Whenever the user clicks on save button, so we are coming to, through this controller, and we are getting this total data, and then we are setting this data to this model which is already there inside this particular view. Okay, to do that, so let's go back to this Eclipse. So this is a model which we set to view, and this is the model which we are setting to the dialog. Now we have two models, separate models. One is for view and this is for a dialog. So now we enter the data, and then if you want to get the data, then we are implementing this and we are getting the data, that is, this is a dialog data. Now we need to set this data to the model of the view, right? So for that, what we have to do is, so let's go back to this open, yes, save button, and we got the data. Okay, dialog data, and then we need to get the data of the view, right? So this is view data, right? This dot get view dot get model dot get data, that means it will give you this object. So in this object, okay, so in this object, so I have something called as students. So I'm gonna push the dialog data into this particular students array. Okay, so now this is the view data we have, and then what we need to do is, so let's create a for loop. Okay, so let's create a for loop, and then, so let me do one thing here. So what I will do is, so I'll come here, I will go here. So instead of that, mm, what we can do is, we have a view data, and then we need to push the data into the view data. Yes, so we have a data here. So now what I can do is view data dot students dot push or dialog data. So that means I'm just getting the data of the dialog box here, and then I'm just pushing it to this particular view data. This view data is already mapped to this particular view.xml. So that means whichever the data is in here, that will be rendered on the screen. Okay, so once you modify the view data, then we need to set the data back to the model. So how can we set? So get the model, this dot get view dot get model dot set data, and then set the view data. Okay, so then finally, once you set the data to the model, then finally you have to close this. So before that, save this and then go back to the browser and then refresh this. Okay, so click on this button and then let's say this one, and then click on, select anything and click on OK. You can see here there is one record got inserted. So but this dialog box not closed. For that we have to close the dialog box. So like this. Okay, so once you close the dialog box, so that's it, right? So now go back to the browser again, so then refresh this. Okay, and click on this and enter some values, and then some date, and then click on save it. So now we entered this, so click on this again. So now if you can see here, soon after we are opening this dialog box, we are not clearing these boxes. Okay, so we need to clear all this data. So you can see here all, see this is also got changed, right? So to fix this, let me go back to the view. Okay, so let me go back, sorry, let me go back to the Eclipse, and in here, so the reason behind this is the, here we are passing, where is this opening dialog box, save button, and in here, so whenever we are opening this particular model, or sorry, whenever you are opening this particular dialog box, so we are setting the data here. The data is this dot student. So this dot student will be passed by reference. So once you pass the reference, then obviously wherever you change, so that will get affected in here also. So that is the reason to remove the reference. So then obviously we have to use something called as JSON dot stringify and JSON dot parse. Okay, so now how can we use that? So we have to use like this, and then we need to pass this data object in here. That means the reference will be removed, and it will be considered like a pass by value. Okay, so let's save this and then go back to the browser, and let's refresh the browser and then execute this scenario. Okay, so click on add. Again there is some error, so let's press F12. Okay, so go back to the console. Data T is not defined. Okay, it's not data T, it is data only, right? So here just remove the T. Okay, save this and go back to the browser and then refresh the browser. So click on this and enter A. Okay, so let's select some value and then enter only random values and click on this again. See, now you are not able to get the data back, right? So now enter B, and here B, that means it is not retaining the previous state. So now I can enter C. Okay, so like this we are going to enter as many values as we can, right? So now what we can do is, whenever the user clicks on edit, okay, so we need to get the data behind this particular row, and then we need to open the same dialog box with this particular data. So how can we do that? So we have to implement this particular method first, right? So let's go back to the view, I mean to say the Eclipse. Okay, so in here what you can do is, so there is, yes, there is a method provided, so copy this method and go back to your controller and try to implement this method. Okay, so dot function. Okay, and this function by default it will accept a parameter called o event. Okay, so now we created this function, and then what we need to do is, so we need to get the data behind this particular object first. So in case if you want to get the data behind this object, so o event dot get source, so we'll give you the source of this particular button. So what is that source? It will give you the total row. From that, so for each and every row there will be a binding context. Okay, so from the binding context of that particular row we can get the object behind that particular row. Okay, so once you get the object like this, so let's save the object in a variable. Okay, like this. So once you save the variable, so then, so we need to set this particular data. That means we got the data behind that row. We need to set this particular data to the model of the dialog. So that means in case if you want to access the model, so this is the model. Sorry, in case if you want to access the dialog, so this is the dialog. So and get the dialog and get the model, and then set that set the data to this particular dialog like this. Okay, so get the dialog box and get the model from that, and then set the data. So what is this data? This is the one which we get from the row, right? So once you get the data, so then try to open the dialog. Okay, so click on this and then just open the dialog like this dot new student dialog dot open. Okay, save this and go back to the browser. Okay, go back to the browser and try to refresh this, and then click on add and then enter a, and then let's say it is 9 a some dummy data, and then try to create one more record b. Okay, b and then male, and then see here b and then okay. So if you can see here b, okay, it's not getting this. Okay, here it is rendering only female, but we selected male, right? So what is the why it is rendering female though we selected male? So that means there is some obviously code fix to needs to be done. So let's go back to the page. Okay, so while we are pushing, where we are pushing these objects, when the users click on save, right? So that means save button press. So in here, so we are pushing the dialog data. So in here we need to change. So before that, let's go back to this one. So what we are doing here, we are mapping gender text, right? So that means we need to modify this particular gender text. How can we modify? So from the data we need to get the gender. If the gender is 0, then it is a male, otherwise it is a female, right? So first do that one. Okay, so to do that, so go to this controller, and then so before pushing the data, yes, okay, so get the data, dialog data, and then gender. If the gender is 1, then it will return male, otherwise it will return female. So that means gender text, we are saving it and then we are pushing it in here. Okay, let's save this and go back to the browser and then try to refresh this and execute the same scenario. Okay, yes, yeah, and then same, select some random dates and give some data, and then B, yeah, and then now it is a male, and then give B, click on this. Now you can see it is a male here, right? So next, so now we implemented this edit button, right? So whenever you click on this edit, now you can see I click edit in this particular first row, so that is the reason I'm getting all this. This is August 15th, right? Cancel this. This is August 15th. This is August 16th, and it is male and it is B. If I click edit button in here, so it will open that. So August 16 male and this one, right? So now whenever we change this, right, we need to change, I mean whenever we change the data, we need to save this particular data back to this particular table. So how can we do that? So whenever you click on this, so it is creating one more record. So this is not the right way, right? So that means what? So we need to identify the record, and then we need to change the data behind this. To do that, then obviously we should have an ID for each and every row. So to create that, so let's create one uh, one generic ID. So let me create one variable. Okay, let me go back to the controller, and then here I will create one ID, one variable. So this is student ID. Okay, so then obviously we need to give one more value inside the this one. So ID equals to this dot student ID. Okay, so once you give this ID, then each and every time when the user clicks on the uh, you know uh, add student, so we need to set the data, right? So what I will do is go back to the button so go back to the method called add student. Where is this add student? Yeah, once you set the model, before, yes, come here and then paste it here. This dot student dot id equals to this dot id. Okay, so for the first time it is 0, right? So when the user clicks, so let's say when the user opens this dialog box, it is 0. Let's say when the user saved this one, and then if you the user trying to create one more object, then we need to increment this value. So where can we increment? Once the user saved this particular data, right? So that means let's go back to the save callback handler. Okay, where is the save, and then in here create, sorry, increment this particular value, so that for the next object it will be a different value. So this is how we are going to create this is how we are going to um, generate a random sorry, unique IDs. Okay, so now let's save this, and now, so once the user clicks on, okay, let me go back to the browser and execute the same scenario. Okay, so click on here and and some mail, and then let me create, select some random. Okay, save, and then click on this and then let's create this, and then again, so let's create B. Okay, save this. So when the user clicks on this, we are opening this one again, and when the user clicks on this, we need to update the same record. That means we have created IDs for this. Now when the user clicks on this save button, we need to identify, so whether the user clicked on edit button or add button. So how can we do this? Now if we click on this, it will create a duplicate record. So but we should identify where the user clicks, right? So for that, when the user clicks on edit button, so let's go back to the controller and create a variable called editing is true. Okay, let's go back to the edit student. Okay, so once the dialog box has been opened, so I'm just say creating one variable called GB editing. So once it is editing, okay, so when the user clicks on the save button, so then we need to check whether this is editing or not. Okay, so let me go back to the save button. Yes, sorry, save callback handler. So in here, so what we need to do is, so if the user is editing this, okay, if the user is editing this, editing the record, okay, so then what we need to do is we need to iterate through the data. Okay, so let me take this data somewhere. Okay, view data. Okay, copy here. Okay, cut it and copy here. And now what you need to do is, so once if the user is editing, that means it should be either one of the objects in this data, right? So now just write a for loop in such a way that it should identify that record. Okay, so just write a for loop so that iterates till the length of these records. Okay, so then get each and every record one by one like this, and then check whether the ID exists or not. Okay, if this view data ID is equals to the dialog box data ID, okay, so what you need to do is we need to get the dialog box data. So get the temporary variable, that means this is the view data, this is the object which they are trying to edit, and then get the total object and assign to this particular object. So once you get this, and then anyways we face a problem with the gender rendering, so then implement the same logic which is implemented in here, and then set this particular data back to the view data. Okay, so how can you do this one, this way. Okay, so your temporarily this particular temp is now our dialog box data, so this we are getting setting at this particular index because this is found in this particular index. We are replacing that, and then what we are doing is we are just breaking this particular for loop. Okay, so once you do this, then so b dot editing, so make this b dot editing is false. Okay, so make the b dot editing is false somewhere. Yes. Okay, so inside this inside this if loop, and then so you modified the view data, and then we need to set the data back to the view again like this. Get data dot get, sorry, get this dot get view dot get model dot set data. So once you set the data back, then close the new dialog box, and then finally return from here. Okay, save this, and then go back to the browser, and let's see whether it will it will get execute properly or not. Okay, let's refresh this, and there is some error, and press F12, and it is saying that controller.js token expected. Okay, there is some error in this, so let's try to resolve that. Yes, the error is here. Okay, it's supposed to be a semicolon, sorry. Okay, save this and go back to the browser, and then try to refresh this. See, now I'm just clicking on this, and I'm trying to add one student, let's say A, and then enter some value, click on save, it got added, and the ID got generated. Now it is the 0, and then I'm trying to add one more, and B, and let's say it is this one, male, B, then save it. Now if I click on this, so now what I'll do is A updated. Now if I click on save, you can see here only this is getting updated. If I click on this, I'm getting the B, and I'm just updating this name. Okay, updated. Okay, I click on save, this is getting updated. So this is how you are gonna add and update the records, and whenever you click on this, you are selecting the object and then you are rendering it over here. Okay, updated again, let's say 1. So click on this, you can see this one. So whenever the user clicks on delete button, we need to delete this row. How can we delete this row? So obviously there is a callback handler for this particular delete button, right? So let's go back to the Eclipse again. Okay, let's go back to the Eclipse and go to this test XML, and then try to implement this particular method. Okay, copy this and then go back to your controller and try to implement this particular method, comma, so put it and save this and function. Okay, and then save this here. Okay, give by default obviously there is a parameter called O event. Okay, bye. So let's go to this method and try to implement this. So now when the user clicks on this, then O event, and from the O event we can get the binding source, I mean the binding object, right? So O event dot O source will give you the exact row where this particular delete button presents, and then you can get the binding context of that, and then from that you can get the object which is binded to that particular row. Okay, so this is how you are going to get the object of this particular row. Okay, so we are going to save this object inside this variable, and then let's get the data, view data. Okay, so in case if you want to get the data from the view, I mean to say from the model which is already binded to the view, so then use this line of code. Okay, so this dot get view dot get model dot get data, so it will give you the total data. So what is the total data? This one, right? So this one from here, so you can get the student objects, right? So go back here and then try to implement that. Okay, so once you try to iterate this students, and then try to find out where the user clicked. That means we got the row which we are deleting, and then we got the total data, and then we need to remove this object from this data. That means we need to iterate this, and then we need to find out where this particular object present, and then delete that object. So for that obviously we need to iterate this particular view data, right, since it is an array. Okay, I'm just iterating that, and then I'm just trying to identify uh, this particular object. So iterate this and then get each and each and every object and save it to the temporary variable, and then finally, so there is an ID generated for each and every object. So let's check for the ID. If this ID, this temporary, that means if this students has this particular ID, that means the current object of the ID of the current object and then ID of the deleting object is equal, then what you need to do is we need to delete the object from that array. So if in case if you want to delete the object, there is a method called splice. Okay, so this is what, so view data dot, so we are going to delete the data from this particular array. So this array dot splice, this is the index where it presents, and then delete one. Okay, so we are deleting one. Once we delete this, let's break this particular loop. Okay, so let's break the loop, and then finally set the data back to the view. Okay, so how will you set the data back? So this is a view data. From here we removed one object, and then we need to set this data back to the model which is there on top of the view, right? So that means this dot get view dot get model will give you the model which is binded to the view. From for that particular model we are setting the data back. So this data contains the removed object. I mean to say this data sorry, this particular array will not be having the object which we removed, right? So now let's save this and go back to the browser, and then refresh this. Okay, and then click on add. So let me create some dummy data here. Okay, so save it and then create one more. Sorry, it's a B and then B. Okay, so this is, let's say, mail B. So save it and then create one more called C. Okay, C and then mail, and then save it. Now let's try to edit one of these variables. UP updated and save it. It got updated. Let's click on this delete now. So I'm just deleting the C. If I click on this delete, so it will delete this one. If I click on A, it will delete A. So still I am here, right? So if I click on edited, if I want to edit this, updated again. Okay, click on save. See, it is updating. So this is a very lengthy tutorial, but still I cannot reduce this one. So yes, so this is how we are going to add the data to the table, or it's kind of a CRUD operations. These are all the CRUD operations: how to create the object and how to delete the object and how to update the object with the help of SAPUI5, and that too the objects are in model, right? So in case if you want to give a database connection to this, then obviously what you can do is, so let me go back to this, and in here, so instead of creating the objects like this, students like this, so what you can do is you can have one ajax call to the database. Once you get the data, you can set the model over here. So wherever you are updating the data, there you are going to update the data to the data in the backend. Okay, so wherever you are updating and wherever you are inserting, there should be a database call in case if you want to give a database connectivity to this application. Okay. Okay, so this is how we are going to do CRUD operations with SAP UI5 models. And yes, yeah, that's it for this tutorial. Let's meet in the next tutorial. Thanks for watching.